In 1884, New York laughed at a building so far from civilization they said it belonged in the Wild West. 10 years later, everyone wanted to live inside it.
How one man's gamble changed the way America lives. In the early 1880s, New York City ended long before 72nd Street. Beyond that line lay rocky ground, scattered shacks, wandering goats, and silence. No banker lived there, no aristocrat visited, and no sensible man would ever build a palace. Then Edward Clark did exactly that. When construction began on a massive fortress-like structure along what would later be called Central Park West, the city laughed. Newspapers mocked it. Social elites sneered at it. Critics gave it a nickname meant to humiliate its creator. They called it Clark's Folly. They said it was too far from civilization, too strange, too expensive, and doomed to fail. They were wrong. What rose from that wilderness would become the Dakota, the first true luxury apartment building in America, and a blueprint for how the wealthy would live for the next century. Chapter 1. A Fortune Built on Scandal. The money that built the Dakota did not come from railroads or oil. It came from sewing machines and from one of the most scandalous men of the 19th century. Isaac Merritt Singer was brilliant, reckless, and utterly without restraint. Born in 1811, Singer ran away from home at 12, dreaming of fame on the stage. He failed as an actor, but discovered something far more valuable. He could invent. By 1851, Singer had redesigned the sewing machine into something the world had never seen: fast, reliable, and revolutionary. But genius alone does not build empires. That task fell to Edward Clark. Clark was everything Singer was not: disciplined, cautious, legally precise. Where Singer created chaos, Clark created systems. Together, they formed the Singer Manufacturing Company, and Clark quietly changed American capitalism by introducing installment payments. Suddenly, ordinary families could afford machines that once cost a year's salary. Sales exploded. So did Singer's personal life. He maintained multiple families at once, dozens of children, false names, secret households. When the truth surfaced in 1860, it detonated across New York society. Singer fled to Europe in disgrace, dying years later among unimaginable wealth. Clark inherited control. At 65 years old, with more money than he could ever spend, Clark turned his attention to something radical. He wanted to change how Americans lived. A dangerous idea. In 19th century New York, apartments were for the poor. Respectable families lived in private townhouses. They did not share walls. They did not ride elevators with strangers. They did not entrust their comfort to a building. Clark disagreed. He had studied Europe, Paris, Vienna, London, where the wealthy lived in grand apartment houses without shame. He believed New York would one day do the same. But first, someone had to prove it. Clark chose the most unfashionable land he could find, the empty west side of Central Park. The price was low because no one wanted it. That made it perfect. He commissioned architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg and gave him one instruction: spare no expense. A fortress for the elite. What Hardenberg designed defied classification. Part castle, part palace, part medieval fortress. 8 stories tall, wrapped in buff brick and sandstone, crowned with steep gables and ironwork, it looked more European than American. Inside, nothing was standard. No two apartments were the same. Some had 4 rooms, others had 20. There were servant staircases hidden from residents, service elevators that never crossed paths with families, a central courtyard where carriages could enter unseen from the street. The Dakota had electricity when most of New York still used gas, central heating when coal stoves ruled the city, hydraulic elevators when many feared vertical living. Even the floors were soundproofed with mud hauled from Central Park. This was not an apartment house. It was a machine for luxury. A dream without its dreamer. Edward Clark never saw the Dakota finished. In 1882, 2 years before completion, he died suddenly at 70. Newspapers barely mentioned his strange building in their obituaries. It opened in 1884, and something extraordinary happened. Before the doors officially opened, every apartment was taken. There was a waiting list. The people who swore they would never live in apartments rushed to claim them. Clark's Folly had become New York's most desirable address. A building that outlived its time. For decades, the Dakota remained fully occupied through depressions, wars, and social upheaval. Artists, musicians, financiers, and intellectuals filled its halls. It became a sanctuary, a symbol, a silent witness to history. And on a cold December night in 1980, the world watched in horror as John Lennon was murdered beneath its archway, forever tying the building to modern tragedy. Yet the Dakota endures, not because of scandal, not because of fame, but because one man believed cities could change and dared to build for a future no one else could see. They called it madness. History called it vision. The Clark Dynasty. Edward Clark died believing in a future he would never see. But his building did not die with him. For the next 77 years, the Dakota remained in the hands of a single family, the Clarks. Ownership passed to Edward Clark's grandson, Edward Severin Clark, a boy of 12. Trustees managed the building until he came of age, and they did something unusual in New York real estate. They did not squeeze it for profit. Rents rose slowly. Tenants stayed for decades. Some families lived there for generations. The Dakota was not treated as a business. It was treated as a legacy. Between 1884 and 1929, the building never once had a vacancy. Not during recessions, not during financial panics, not even during World War I. In a city defined by constant turnover, the Dakota became something rare, a permanent home. The Dakota becomes a gatekeeper. As New York modernized, the Dakota changed in a different way. It became selective. By the early 20th century, the building had developed its own internal rules, unwritten at first, then formalized. Tenants were no longer just renters. They were carefully chosen. The Dakota was evolving into something new, a cooperative. Buying an apartment did not mean owning it outright. It meant buying shares, and more importantly, it meant being approved. Money was not enough. The board wanted discretion, privacy, compatibility. They rejected people who were too loud, too controversial, too disruptive. Even the rich could be turned away. Inside its walls, power shifted quietly, from wealth to reputation. Artists, icons, and creative refuge. Despite its strictness, the Dakota attracted a certain kind of resident: artists. The Steinway family lived there, filling its halls with music. Actors, writers, and composers followed. The building's thick walls and courtyard silence made it ideal for creativity. No traffic noise, no street chaos. Inside the Dakota, New York felt distant. By the mid-20th century, the building had become a magnet for cultural figures, people who valued privacy as much as prestige. That reputation would define its future. The night the world looked at the Dakota. On December 8, 1980, the Dakota entered global history. John Lennon returned home that night with Yoko Ono. He never made it inside. The gunshots echoed beneath the same archway once designed to shield residents from the outside world. Millions watched the Dakota on television, police lights flashing against its Gothic facade. For the first time, the building was no longer just a symbol of luxury. It was a symbol of loss. The Dakota became inseparable from that moment, a place of beauty permanently marked by tragedy. The most powerful address in New York. After Lennon's death, the Dakota's rules hardened. Fame became a liability. Celebrities were rejected. Public figures were turned away. Some of the richest people in the world failed to gain approval. Even in modern New York, where almost anything can be bought, the Dakota remains impossible to force. You cannot demand entry. You cannot rush approval. And you cannot buy your way past the board. Apartments sell for tens of millions, but power still belongs to the building, not the buyer. Why the Dakota still matters. Today, skyscrapers tower above it. Glass and steel surround its brick walls. Yet the Dakota remains untouched. No flashy renovations, no luxury rebranding, no surrender to trends. It still operates on the same principle Edward Clark believed in, that a building should shape how people live, not the other way around. The Dakota was not ahead of its time by accident. It was built for the future on purpose. Ending. Madness that became law. Edward Clark was mocked for building too far north, for believing people would share walls, for trusting strangers to live as neighbors. Every modern luxury apartment building in America now follows his model. Shared services, elevators, security, prestige addresses. What was once called folly became standard. They called it madness, then they copied it. And the Dakota still stands, not as a relic, but as the original rule book.